Gotta wait here. All right. Are we set now?
We're set.
All right. As far as this meeting, we do have a ethics training that we need to do. With the decision that the commission members are mandatory filers, one of the things that we need to do is have ethics training. I believe it's every 2 years. And we wanted to make sure that we provided it to all of the commission members in a format that was convenient. So we are going to do that for the second half of this meeting. So from 11 to 1 will be our ethics training, and hopefully we can get through our business before then. The other thing I wanted to do before we get started with the formal agenda, Superintendent D'Amico, I'm sure people have heard, has stepped down as superintendent of the state police. This probably will be his last meeting as a member of the commission. I just wanted to thank you, Superintendent. I think both to your work with the state police and your work on the commission, you've brought a tremendous amount of integrity and professionalism, and certainly I know I appreciate it, and I think I speak for all of the commission members in saying how much we appreciate the work that you've done and the contributions you've made to the commission, and we'll certainly miss you. So thank you, and we wish you all the best. And I do think Brian has a plaque for you, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm going to let you hold it. There you go. That's very good. So I just wanted to say, Mike, thanks. It's been my privilege to serve on the commission, and not only as a commission member, but as a custodian of the state lab system. You know, the work that you do here is just so important to maintain the highest standards, the integrity, the accuracy, the reliability of our criminal forensic labs is just so important to ensure whether we're looking for convictions or we're looking for exonerations for people who are not guilty. It's just so important that the lab piece is never the issue here. So I thank you all for your partnership in this, and I wish you all well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Peter Neufeld also reached out to me and indicated that he has a desire to step away from the work on the commission, and I do, we're working toward having a replacement for the next meeting, so I did want to make sure that we had a chance to recognize Peter. Peter has been doing this for a long time now. I won't say how long, but I think in terms of knowledge, both in the area of DNA and just knowledge in terms of forensic work in general, you bring a knowledge and a perspective to the commission that's just been invaluable. You're obviously a very passionate advocate for the things that you believe in, making sure that the work is done right, that the system works properly, that the people who shouldn't be held accountable aren't, and those who should be are. And again, I certainly greatly appreciate the contributions that you've made to the commission. I can only speak to the ones that I've seen during my time here, but I know they go far beyond that. And I'm sure I speak for everyone on the commission in expressing our thanks for all of the time and effort and work that you've put in, for the contributions you've made. Again, I'll certainly miss you. I'll miss the perspective you bring to the commission, and I wish you the best in everything you do. And again, I think Brian has a plaque for you.
Well, not dead yet. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. I'm not dead yet. The plaque speaks for itself. It says from 1994 to 2016. The simple explanation is 22 years is enough. And I will remain on the commission until my replacement is actually selected by the governor. So there won't be any kind of absence like that. I thank you all as well. I've been here through so many commissioners and so many different issues that one cannot summarize them, but certainly it's been an extraordinary experience, and I certainly appreciate all that you've all done in this endeavor, and hopefully I'll figure other ways that I can contribute to the process. So thank you.
I assume everyone's received a draft agenda for today's meeting. Are there either any comments, or if not, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
All right, do we have a second? All right, Scott, thank you. All in favor? Say aye. Anyone opposed? All right, so that carries. I don't see it on here, but I believe we also had the minutes for our prior meeting sent around. Hopefully everyone has received those. Do we have any comments with regard to the minutes?
Yeah, I do. What I like is this the first time that the minutes actually have the times on the side of the tape?
We've been doing that for about a year, I'm guessing.
About a year? Okay, I noticed it for the first time. And I apologize that, I haven't gone back and looked at the tape, but when you get to the, I guess the second page, last paragraph, old business, there's an indication there about a discussion of mixture interpretation. The comment I have is that there was an exchange between Brian and myself with respect to CPI, and the comments that Brian made with respect to the review of mixtures that was going on with the Texas Forensic Science Commission had to do with all that was really going on is that people were looking at the old mixture interpretation with, quote, a different set of goggles. And that I then said, no, I don't think that's what's going on. What's going on is that CPI, whether it's the best way to interpret mixtures or not, was a formula, and that the correction done by the FBI with the SWGDAM was simply saying people are not following the mathematical formula correctly. They're not applying it correctly, and that is what's going on with Texas. And Brian and I had a back and forth about what's going on in Texas. I serve on the Legal Resource Committee of the Organization of Scientific Area Committees with Lynn Garcia, who is the General Counsel to the Texas Forensic Science Commission. I talked with her about it. She said she had had similar conversations with Brian where he had used the same analogy with respect to goggles. I think Brian is wrong about that scientifically. That is not as what's going on. That the labs in Texas simply were doing CPI incorrectly. And at that time, I also asked that we have a process of going back and making sure that our labs in New York State were not similarly misapplying the CPI formula. And I'm looking, Brian, I didn't see anything about how that was going to go about in the agenda here.
I didn't see it as an agenda item.
Well, I thought that you were going to do something about that and come up with a plan. I certainly was requesting that at the time. So I think you were wrong scientifically about what's going on in Texas, wrong about the CPI, and I still have this concern. So I want the minutes, somehow we should just have a correction in the minutes, or at least a more expanded recitation of what you said, Brian, and what I said. I think that would, I'm only asking for that to be supplemented in the minutes.
I guess, Barry, I appreciate your point, but the reason we have the recording, we can't go through and transcribe the entire recording and put them into the minutes. So, these minutes are just basically meant as a reference to try and refer people to the places. Obviously, it appears that you've gone and looked at the recording. We've got the annotated times here so people can do that. I think the recording lays out the entire conversation, and I just, if there's, like a specific, subject matter heading or something you think that was missed, fine, but, to go and, transcribe that entire section into the minutes, I just don't see that we're going to do that.
I'm not even suggesting that. What I'm just suggesting is that in the minutes of this meeting, right, that there be a reflection that I'm contesting, or at least I'm asking that there be a more expanded summary of what went on at the last meeting, because number one, I think what Brian said was wrong. Number two, I double-checked it with the head of the Council of the Texas Forensic Science Commission, and she agreed with my interpretation and had similar conversations with Brian. And number three, the minutes of this meeting should now reflect that he didn't think it important enough to even put on the agenda how, if at all, we were going to go back and look at the potential that other labs in New York had also made incorrect CPI calculations as it occurred in Texas. So,
all right, so
I just want that on the record right now, and that's the end of it. All right?
It's on the record. We appreciate your comments. With that, any other comments with regard to the minutes of our prior meeting, the March 16th meeting? If not, do I have a motion to approve those minutes? All right, do I have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right,
For the
thank you.
reasons I stated.
One abstention.
2 abstentions.
All right, the next thing we have on our accreditations and laboratory updates. Brian, do you want to take us through those?
Sure. The first thing is a merger between one of the accreditation providers that's used by New York State, ASCAD Lab, and ANAB. So recently, in the end of April, they announced a merger between these two providers. The Office of Forensic Services had been conducting a comparison of accreditation providers, and ANAB was one of the other ones that we were looking at as a potential vendor for New York State. So this thing merges those two together. I had asked the people from both of those entities, ASCAD Lab and ANAB, to be at this meeting to address any questions, and they had asked if we could actually have them come in September. Right now they're in the process of updating their supplementals, which are there's the ISO 17025 standard, and then along with the 17025 standard is the supplementals that the accrediting body sets, which are the additional standards. So they're in the process of aligning between these two bodies and updating those standards. So they will have that done by the next September meeting and can have a more meaningful discussion about any changes, any concerns, any questions that the commission might have. So at this point, it's just a bookmark to let you know, first off, that it happened. We included the press release that came out about it, and also to let you know that they will be at the next commission meeting on September 17th to discuss in detail the merger and any questions or concerns that anyone might have.
Can I comment on that for a minute?
Sure.
I think this is, I don't think it's so much as a merger as it's a complete takeover of ASCAD Lab. Didn't we have them come in and present to us a while ago, Brian, when some of us were asking that there be a new accrediting body other than just ASCAD Lab?
Approximately 2 years ago, FQS came and presented. FQS became ANAB, so
Right.
Yes.
Right, and I thought that their presentation was superior. I think this is a welcome development, a long time in coming. I think that it might be, so I look forward to, I feel a little bit better about the fact that they're taking over, because for reasons that, I've stated many times, and certainly Marvin has, he's not here, so I'll speak for Marvin. We all know that Marvin has had a lot of criticisms with respect to the way ASCAD Lab has performed its business, so I think this is a welcome development, and the commission might take this as an opportunity to really look at a whole range of issues, particularly proficiency testing and how we can improve proficiency testing and try to actually get error rates in a whole bunch of other disciplines. So it's welcome development, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. The next is the Erie County Department of Central Police Services Laboratory. They had an expanded surveillance visit. Members of the laboratory, I believe, are up in the Albany location if there's any questions, or available via phone. I'm not sure which. Albany.
John Simich is here in Albany.
So the documents in your binders, if there's any questions.
Yeah, John, I have some questions here. So, could you explain very simply what was going on with respect to the issue here was not using as many blank reagents, reagent blanks? How do you describe what the nonconformity was?
When in some cases we get two separate swabs from one item, and we extract them. You have to extract them individually just because of the volume. So you're extracting two tubes of evidentiary material. Then we combine them at a later step and concentrate the liquid down to get the maximum DNA into one tube for amplification. The standard is that the reagent blank is to be run at the same volume and concentration as the maximum casework sample. We were not running two reagent blank tubes and combining them. We were only doing one. It was an oversight on our part. The auditor was reviewing cases, and he came across one that had that in there, and he made note of it that we need to do two reagent blanks if we're doing two sample tubes and combining them. So he pointed it out, and we have now changed our policy on that.
Right, and just for the record, there's a yellow, I guess it's on, how do you characterize the page?
Highlighted, yes, yellow highlighted is the policy.
Highlighted in yellow. So in terms of trying to figure out whether,
I have it here.
so these reagent blanks are like negative controls, right? That,
Yes.
Are designed to detect whether you have contamination. So if you're not running them properly, I saw that in your corrective action that what you said you were doing is going back and looking at old casework, and you didn't see any problematic DNA profiles. Is that really adequate? I mean, if you're talking about blank reagents, and they're supposed to detect some level of contamination where you're looking at mixtures, how did you go about doing it? I'm just curious.
Well, we were confident in that we don't see contamination in our reagent blanks. So at the level that we're running it, and we don't see any pattern of extra DNA in any sample tube. So if the reagents were contaminated, we would expect to see additional DNA profiles in the sample tubes. We would see a pattern. We would see them in multiple tubes, and we're not seeing that. So we're confident that our reagents are not contaminated. We quality control test them before they are put into use, and it's a good quality system that we have. So as far as past cases go, which is what I think you're asking, we're confident that we don't have any contamination concerns and that those results are valid.
My question is slightly different, and it's because I'm not a scientist. What was the quality assurance reason that they wanted two blanks as opposed to one?
When we run two sample tubes and combine them, we need to run two blanks and combine them so we have the same concentration of reagents, same volume of reagents are concentrated down between the two of them. They need to match according to the standard.
I'm sorry, I still don't understand. So why is that, from a quality perspective, preferable to the one reagent blank that you ran?
Well, because if you're combining, if you're extracting a larger volume and then concentrating it down, you would be more likely to find any extraneous DNA If it was to occur in the sample tubes, you would recognize it as being extra because you have it in your reagent blank. So the reagent blank has to be run at the same concentration and volume as the maximum sample that you're running. That's how the standard reads.
John, do you mind if I give it a quick shot? I think what happened was several years back, the FBI mandated that your extraction blanks had to be the most sensitive volume as compared to your samples. Occasionally what happens is we'll get point of contact samples that are really minute, and we know if we extract one sample alone, we're just not going to get a result. So what we do is we combine the two samples and then concentrate them down so that we maximize the amount of DNA that was in the two separate swabs.
Right.
If you're not doing that simultaneously with the negative, if you have one extraction negative and you extract it and you amp it, you may get nothing. But if you take the two together, combine them, and then drop it down to a very low volume, if there is low-level contamination in both of the negatives, there's a possibility that you might see it on the combination of the two negatives. So what you're doing is you're bringing it down to the most sensitive volume so that if there is something or minute contaminant in some of your reagents, then you'll be able to see it in that type of a setup. So that's the only reason why.
So to put it in simple terms, that this is a quality control measure to detect contamination, particularly in low-level samples where you're having to combine them, right?
Correct.
All right. And so, which is what led to my question, Jack, and that is, it seems to me that I would just like to know a little bit more about how you can be so sure in all the different old cases that you ran, that when you're dealing with low-level items in your mixtures, that those are not contaminants when you, as opposed to being real, or, well, they're not contaminants when you didn't run those two blanks at the same time in the first place. I'm not sure that's so easy to do, or at least I'd love some more detail about how you know this, what you looked at, how many of those old cases had low-level oils that you were calling or, dismissing for some reason or another.
Well, as I said, when we're reviewing our cases, looking at the results, we are comparing them to other samples that are run in the same batch. The analyst is doing that to make sure there's no additional contaminants present. We're running them through the database to make sure there's no staph contamination present. We do that with every sample, and we don't see that. So that gives us the confidence that we're not seeing any significant contamination that is contributing to the DNA profile in our samples from the reagents being contaminated or mishandling of the reagents.
Can I offer one more thing? So, John, I completely understand what you're saying, and I'm not concerned at all. If the extraction negative is basically all the components of your extraction, so all the reagents. If there were a problem with the extraction negative, you would kind of see it in multiple samples within the extraction set. So I think what John is trying to say is that they're comparing it so that there aren't similarities in the minor components of all the case samples.
No, I understand that he's saying he's looking at the minor components of case samples and trying to see if there were.
You would see commonality.
Well,
there were.
I don't know about that. I mean, because you'd have to go back and check your lots, make sure that they're the same. I mean, I just don't know. So I'm not. I'm not making this any kind of pejorative criticism. It just seems to me that obviously having two extraction blanks is a negative control against contamination, particularly when you're combining low-level samples. That seems to me a very important quality assurance measure, right? To the point where it's, been, I don't know, what is this, PCR 9 results document 1137, what is that? Where does that come from, Is that the manufacturer's requirement, or is that some SWIG dam guideline? What is that?
That's our another part of our manual. That just references another part of our manual.
So in other words, this was something that was in your manual that you weren't doing?
No, it was not in our manual to run the same number of reagent blanks as samples. We had to modify that policy. We were only running one reagent blank.
All right, but the requirement that you run 2, what is the source of that? Was that in the manufacturer's requirements?
That's in the FBI guidelines, DAB guidelines published by the FBI.
Okay, so it's a DAB guideline requirement. I guess I'd feel more comfortable if you at some point explain to us exactly what you did to look at low-level alleles in these combined samples for the period of time. I mean, how long weren't you doing the 2 swabs?
It's hard to comment. I don't know how long we've been extracting multiple swabs. Not that many agencies submit multiple swabs from one item. We do discourage it. We prefer that they concentrate everything onto one swab. It's more efficient. So there's only a couple that really do that, and it's not even on a regular basis. So to tell you how long we've been doing it, there's no way to check that record.
Well, if it wasn't in your manual, I suppose it would be for years.
Yes, it would be as long as we've been getting the 2 swabs, yes, and combining them.
And I don't know, Pat, if this is your experience as well, but for some reason, given the fact that, in Innocence Project cases, we're very often dealing with really old cases in small amounts. So it's not unusual in the hard cases, so to speak, to combine swabs. So I'm just, maybe it won't be that hard to go back and look at the number of instances and provide some greater detail on the swab combination cases, especially if they're periodic. You would be using different reagents each time, I imagine. So the assumption that you're going to find commonality in the low-level mixtures, I don't know if that necessarily holds, but I would feel more comfortable if you did something like that. If you gave us more detail on exactly what your review of the old cases were.
Is that something, John, that you can get for us by the next meeting? Just give us an update in terms of, what cases you looked at, what time period they were from.
No, it would be really difficult. We have to pull every DNA file and see if we extracted 2 swabs in it. I think that'd be, it certainly could be done, but I don't see what that's going to show or demonstrate, since each extraction, when it's run, is independent of the next extraction that is run. That's why we have to run a reagent blank for each extraction. And the reagents might change between extractions if we happen to make a new lot. So to compare one extraction to another extraction, I don't see the value in that. To see if there's a pattern of contamination, it's within that one batch of 10 cases or 15, however many samples or bad cases that analyst is analyzing. That's where you really are concerned about any type of contamination, or you're going to see a pattern of recurring contamination.
If I heard you right, though, did you say that you did go back and look at certain cases to see whether or not you saw a pattern?
No, we did not go back and look at other cases to see if we saw a pattern. We do that with every batch that we extract. We don't, and they are examined and tested and run through CODIS to see if there's any staff contamination concerns. So our quality program does that with every extraction batch, and we did not go back. Barry said that we went back, but we did not go back and look at cases.
All right. Well, I guess maybe I was misreading what you said you did here under corrective action, and I just assumed.
I apologize if I forgot what I said.
All right. Well, in terms of corrective action, if I could find it, I know that you said you stopped using only one reagent blank and you went back and started using two. And if I understand what you're saying now, is that you're simply assuming that you would have seen a pattern. And you didn't actually go back and look at old cases to see a pattern.
2 cases.
What? It's 2 cases.
Case files examined.
So Ann is pointing to which page is it?
The auditors reviewed 2 cases, yes.
2 cases.
When the auditor was looking at their cases for each analyst, there were 2 cases that they came across where 2 swabs were extracted and combined. That is the auditor's finding.
Right, well, okay, I knew somebody had decided that it was a good idea to go back and look at cases. So now we know that you didn't do any of that. That just makes me uncomfortable, Jack. I think that maybe if you did some kind of stratified, random reanalysis of cases where you combined swabs just to see if there was any other problem, that might be a better way of approaching it. That would just make me more comfortable because just intellectually, if you're using the 2 swab method was a negative control to determine contamination, and you just can't say I'm assuming we don't have it because I didn't see it before when I wasn't using the required technique. I just don't think computes. That's just me, and as Peter has said many times, we're not scientists, but we have been looking at a lot of these DNA issues for a long time.
John, from your SOPs, you're a 3,500 lab at this point now, correct?
Yes.
Did this situation occur during the use of 3,500? Or was
Yes,
this something
it did.
that just occurred? Well, this may not make you feel any better, but on 3,500, it is so sensitive that if there's, and this is what Applied Biosystems, and I don't want to put words in Applied Biosystems' mouths, but you'll have to get it from them, is the instrument is so sensitive that if it's there, it's there. And even on a single, and this is just my opinion, even on a single extraction, if there's a minute contaminant in 3,500 analysis, it's going to show up as some kind of either raised baseline or a peak.
Listen, I'm not going to dispute that, right? But obviously, the DAB thought that you needed 2. I mean, so to tell me that it's good enough to do 1 because it's such a sensitive assay may well be right, and this is all a superfluous quality control measure, but
That's
it is
solely
there.
my opinion. Solely my opinion.
I understand, but it's not the DAB's opinion for whatever reason, and I'm not here to dispute who's right or wrong about that. But that is their requirement. And it doesn't.
All right, this issue was
cases
just
about-
on for a report, correct, Brian? There's no vote required at this time?
Correct. Just an update.
All right. I think we've gotten our update, and I appreciate the comments everyone's made. I think the lab knows where everyone's coming from here. So I think if there's any other questions, fine. Otherwise, we better move on.
All right. The next laboratory is the Erie County Toxicology Laboratory. Bill Kaufman is in the Albany location. This will require a vote. So they've had an ABFT inspection. The documents are in your binders. They also have some notices about a QA manager that are in your binder. And again, Bill Kaufman's in the Albany location if there's any questions.
This is Ann. Your new QA officer is taking on a huge job load, including QA responsibilities for several pieces of your agency for which their CV it's not the laboratory, it's all this other stuff you're asking the person to be responsible for. The investigators, the morgue, pathology, and the CV of the individual would not indicate any experience in any of those other areas or disciplines. And I'm concerned that I would ask, how many staff are in the lab? How many specimens are you processing? Is your QA officer going to have time to do 5 jobs?
That's a great question. There is quite a few people in the laboratory and the office that are going to be overseen by her. However, the applicants for that position were very slim. I believe there was 2 applicants. It's difficult to find a QA/QC manager that'll work for that salary. Unfortunately, we had to put somebody in place as soon as possible. I find that the QA/QC person will be of great help to the laboratory once they're fully trained, and that person is now undergoing training. She just got back last week from a training for QA/QC, so it's an ongoing process. It will take time.
But if I were the morgue director, this individual has no experience in being a QA person for that discipline or for the investigators. So why?
I can't answer to the medical examiner staff. I don't know
you
precisely
didn't
what they
appoint this
do.
individual.
I did not. I'm a representative for the laboratory. I'm the senior toxicologist.
My concern is on the record.
I'm sorry. I should have explained that I'm the senior toxicologist. I'm a representative for the lab, sitting in for the director.
I was just wondering, there seems to be a lot of stuff in regards to this ABFT report, and the lab director unfortunately is not available. And no disrespect to Bill, but maybe we could extend their accreditation to the next meeting and have the laboratory director. Now, I'm not advocating that we need to have the laboratory director every time, but I don't know if anyone else has questions, but there is a lot of material here. We do have a short meeting today. And not to put Bill on the spot, but maybe the better person, because they seem to be laboratory-wide points they maybe need to discuss. So I was going to put a motion, but it does require a vote to extend their accreditation until the next meeting, where we could then have a vote. So
I'd just like to raise 2 issues that you could take back in case that happens. And then one is the org chart isn't consistent with what some of the documents indicate. So I think in an email there's some statement that the lab director will still ultimately be responsible for QA management, but it doesn't have that reflected in the org chart. So it's not clear who this new QA person is directly reporting to.
I think they're on the same level. In the org chart, I believe they're on the same level.
Right, but that's not reflected in the email from the lab director who says she's going to be in charge of QA overall.
Would you then like additional documentation to say specifically what will occur there? With
right,
who answers to whom?
What the reporting structure is, and it should reflect who's ultimately responsible for QA. And my other comment is, there's an issue with your safety. It says we're aware of rusted, broken safety equipment, and it'll be replaced with each new phase of construction. Eye washes that were checked weren't functioning correctly, and I understand that as facilities age, that's a problem you can run into, and we've actually had that ourselves. And so an easy, inexpensive fix is you can purchase 2-liter bottles of saline with a top on them for an eye wash to be available in the lab. You can just Google eye wash bottles and you'll find a place to purchase them from, so you don't have to compromise staff safety while you're waiting for them to correct the eye wash stations.
That's a great idea, Commissioner. We do have eye washes that are functional, and they are checked in a timely manner. I believe the inspectors didn't see all the functional eye washes. The showers are a different story. We don't check those as frequently as we should, but in the new updated laboratory during reconstruction, that will be addressed. To have more easily checked, better functioning showers and eye washes for safety purposes.
Yeah, to go back to Scott's suggestion, I do agree. I think there's a lot of issues that are raised here. And honestly, I would like to hear from the lab director about how these issues have been addressed before we have a final vote. I'm open to other suggestions, but I'm inclined to agree with Scott. I think it might be a good idea if we extend the accreditation till the next meeting, with the understanding that we want the lab director at our next meeting to explain what they've done to address all of the issues raised here.
Well, that documentation has been provided to ABFT and the Commission. Those responses that address the deficiencies has been provided to you. And ABFT has found that they are acceptable responses. Do you want something
Hey, Bill, if I could just jump in here. I guess the concern that a lot of the commissioners are seeing are there's some core things, like with the standard operating procedures, that they had not been reviewed last year. When they were reviewed, they're finding handwritten notes from 2008 that had never been memorialized, that notes on the bench were being thrown away as opposed to retained with the records. I think there's some substantive issues that people have been expressing concern about with this. So I understand there's documentation coming back, but to a degree, I think they're also looking to understand what's going on here, what's the dynamic, because essentially voting to approve this accreditation is endorsing the laboratory's ability to do what it needs to do. And I think looking at the concerns that are raised here, I think there's concerns the commission members have about that.
However, ABFT.
That's outstanding.
I think that might be worth putting in the written meeting minutes.
Well, I would second Scott's motion, and let's vote on it.
All right, we have a motion by Scott to extend the accreditation until our September meeting, and direct that the laboratory director be here at our September meeting to address all of the issues raised and what's been done to address them. We have a second for that motion. Any other discussion on the motion?
Maybe just a minor modification, if it's possible, to extend it to September 30th, so there's enough time in case something comes up to make sure we can address it.
That's correct, Brian.
All right, so the motion is to extend it till September 30th of this year, and to direct that the laboratory director appear at our next meeting, our September meeting, and address the issues raised in the report and what's been done to take care of those. So, all in favor? Anyone opposed? Any abstention? All right, thank you.
I just want to say, like I said, I believe the laboratory director's out of the country, so it's not like they didn't want to come to the meeting. And also, I don't think we need to advocate the laboratory director need to speak about every point. We should allow the laboratory director to decide who would be the best person, since we're not all technical experts. But I just wanted to make that point.
I could also interject here that the laboratory director is out of the country, was unable to attend this, and it's unprecedented for the commission to extend this to our laboratory, to provide this extension. I'm glad they're extending it, but it's unprecedented. I feel that throughout the course of the accreditation program, we were one of the initial members of that, and I am a bit taken aback by this, and I think the director will be too. Of course, she can answer to the questions she has. She's provided this to ABFT, and I feel it's a sufficient addressing of their concerns. That is our accrediting body that did the technical and inspection.
Thanks, Bill. The next laboratory is the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office, their forensic toxicology laboratory. This also has a vote required. They underwent their ABFT inspection, and representatives of the laboratory are available if there's any questions. Hearing no questions, do I have a motion to renew the New York State accreditation for the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office Forensic Toxicology Laboratory for the period covering July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2018? Okay, it was seconded.
I'll second it.
All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Peter, I didn't see your hand. I'm sorry.
Went up in the first.
Okay, perfect. So it's unanimous approval. Okay. As another note, just there, Dr. Bino, who's been with the Monroe County Lab for many moons, is retiring, I believe, today. So there is a acting director, Dr. David Nemeth, who will be in his place until they complete a search process. And the notifications of that are also in your binder. The next laboratory is the Nassau County Office of Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology. It's a mid-cycle review. There's no vote required. This is for informational purposes, and the representatives of the laboratory are available here in New York if there's any questions.
Yeah, whoever. Hi. I'm not sure I quite understood this issue about the quantitation, the methadone issue.
Methadone. Yes.
Yeah, and the nature of the that previously you had only made qualitative reports in the proficiency testing of the urine specimens, and as opposed to these quantitative tests. And then when the quantitative tests were done, it appeared as though the results you were getting were not within 2 standard deviations. Do I have that right?
Not quite.
All right, well, tell me. You tell me. I don't. Not a scientist. Just trying to understand.
The CAP proficiencies, those CAP Ts, urines are not quantitative. So CAP only does the analysis, does the evaluation based upon a qualitative analysis. What we sometimes do to try to give ourselves more information, during our confirmation procedure, we quantitate those samples. What they do is they provide an amount that they added. So we'll sometimes compare the amount that we got to the amount that they added, but it's not formally evaluated by CAP. Urines are strictly evaluated only qualitatively. Okay, is that point clear?
Well, yeah. So
if that's clear, I'll move on.
But what it's looked like to me is that your conclusion here is that there was a problem with the proficiency samples that you were given.
Correct.
And not any problem within the laboratory.
That's right.
That was your conclusion,
yes.
Right? And this is something that I guess you're telling me, and tell me if I've got this right, that is not picked up ordinarily because you just make qualitative reports and not quantitative reports on the proficiency test. Is that right?
You're circling it, but you're not quite right. So
what we do
is the serum proficiencies. Those caps are broken into many times, not always, but oftentimes are broken into 2 types of samples. So serum samples that are provided are quantitative.
Oh, okay.
All right.
We'll jump back to urine then.
So you have serum samples that are qualitatively identified and then quantitative. Urines are strictly qualitative. So that's all in one proficiency. So when we were saying...
Why would urines only be qualitative and not quantitative?
That's how they do it. Because, I think from a toxicological standpoint, urine results don't have a lot of value in terms of interpretation. The urine result is strictly shows use, as opposed to a blood result, which could show impairment or toxicity.
So in other words, the urine is a screening test in a sense, and then you would always want to do a blood test to confirm.
And there are many laboratories out there in the world that use these proficiencies and only do qualitative work. They're just simply trying to identify what's present, what's not present. So then there are labs that only do urines, for example. So CAP has chosen not to evaluate those samples, urines that is, quantitatively.
Do you happen to know whether decisions are made, maybe Scott or others here would know, whether based on the urine screening tests, there are consequences and to individuals that when there are no follow-up blood tests?
That could be the case. There are urine samples that are sometimes provided for DWI, for example. However, those urine results would need to be evaluated in conjunction with observations such as standard field sobriety tests and those kinds of tests that would be associated with someone actually observing impairment. So again, urine results are, by and large, not particularly valuable for determining impairment. They just show use, and that use could have been over several hours or possibly sometimes from several days prior. So the urine results don't have a lot of quantitative value.
I'm just sorry, just a quick aside, but no one in law enforcement is going to use a urine analysis for alcohol because it doesn't tell you whether you blew more than the legal limit.
Correct. I mean, I think we're getting away from what I'm sitting here for. But on the other hand, urine results can be used, but they can only be used in a very specific way. You have to have consecutive samples, and if 2 samples are collected and then used, then certain conclusions can be drawn. But I mean, our laboratory does not do urine alcohol, for example, and I don't know that many of the any of the laboratories in the state are.
This wasn't alcohol. This was with methadone.
Correct.
That's different, right?
Yes.
And
so getting back to what happened here, Mr. Scheck, is that we did methadone and EDDP was the particular analyte that we had a problem with. EDDP is a metabolite of methadone. In that sample that we did quantitate, we correctly identified the methadone, and we correctly identified the EDDP for that matter. And this is done in the exact same extraction, one run. We do them both at the same time. The methadone, we were successful in getting the correct result. In this case, the EDDP, we got the wrong result. Following, a substantial investigation, we were able to demonstrate every time that we extracted that particular proficiency sample that the recovery of the internal standard in that sample, and that's the internal standard is used, it helps us to quantitate. It's a much more accurate way of quantitating samples, is to add an internal standard. Every time we added the internal standard to that proficiency, we ended up getting a very, very reduced recovery of the internal standard, and it was throwing off the result of the EDDP. When we repeated the cases that were run, I think you should realize that all of our proficiencies are run right alongside of our samples, so they're integrated right in with the work. All of the case samples that were run in that run were repeated. We got the identical results that we had previously, and that CAP proficiency, again, showed a problem. We then took multiple steps, which are described in the paperwork that you were given, and we demonstrated over and over again that it was a problem with that proficiency sample. And I would add that we have seen problems with proficiency samples in the past. We've had problems with THC, for example, where we have not reported the THC, even though we know it's there, but we can see that there's something wrong with the proficiency. And what I believe it to be, and this is just my opinion, it's difficult for the providers to make sure that the amount of drug in the samples is uniform across, these go out to labs all across the country. So they have to add a lot of preservatives and other things. Which can sometimes interfere with the analysis. So what we were seeing is a problem that we associate, and I think we clearly demonstrated was only happening in the proficiency sample. We do not see similar problems in our case samples.
But that was my understanding of what you were saying here,
right.
Which I just want to make sure I understood it. So have you complained to CAP? Is this something that other labs are finding? It's kind of distressing when you're talking about drugs, and for reasons that people will be reading about soon, that these kinds of analyses, particularly if you don't have if the proficiency providers are not giving you samples that you can test properly, and it's their problem, right, because of the preservatives they're putting in them, then that seems to be a problem in terms of the drug that is that the issue?
It's a chronic challenge to proficiency test providers We can't dose humans, and so we often can't use human blood. We also can't exsanguinate humans to get a quantity of uniform sample, and so we often turn to animal models who don't metabolize properly, and or the compound is added to the raw biological sample, so you're not putting it through the animal's metabolism. And so these are very often synthetic, best as can be produced. And yes, they have challenges. They will not behave in the lab like a fresh human biological sample. And the way it gets corrected by PT providers is by the consensus result or the common denominator result, and making allowance for the fact that different labs will have different experiences using their methodology for extraction. And that's why many PTs are qualitative, not quantitative, because the quantity value is just not reliable from multiple labs using multiple methods, multiple instruments when you're creating a specimen. So yes, it's true, proficiency tests should never be the primary method by which you assess the quality of a laboratory, and no QA officer would rely on it as their sole method. And that's why.
No, I understand.
But yes, it's a problem.
No, I understand. I think I understand this. My only request to you is that maybe you should. Did you notified CAP of this?
Oh, sure.
Did they give an answer? Did they acknowledge that this was their problem, not yours? Or did they suggest any other ways that they could do this? Or maybe we should be asking them that, because I'm concerned that when you're talking about narcotics and quantities and being able to test that correctly, that these are matters that have real consequences in the legal system far beyond the pretty heavy time is meted out on these kinds of cases.
I mean,
people are pleading all over the place.
We certainly share your concern. I'll say a couple of things. One is, I think it's worth noting how many different drugs that we are attempting to test for.
Yeah.
So you're talking about many, many compounds. So some of these problems can be systemic. Some of them can be more of a one-off kind of a situation where it's unique to that particular proficiency, and it doesn't necessarily extend, become a systemic problem. CAP does not have at this point a mechanism that I'm aware of. I mean, we have tried to explain to them some of the problems that we've had. There's no direct feedback from them, although they do change proficiency providers periodically. And they have recently again changed the proficiency provider. I don't know if that was done based upon some lack of confidence that they had in the previous provider, or if it was an economic. I couldn't say how that happened. The best I can do at the moment right now is just to assure you that, I mean, there was a mistake that was made on our end, and that we could have recognized the lack of response from the internal standard, and probably should have flagged that and done something with it up front. We do integrate these into our casework. We reported it. I have every confidence that we looked at casework. We looked at efficiency samples. We actually went so far as to buy additional quality controls from an outside vendor and run those alongside samples, and demonstrated again that we were getting the correct results except for that one proficiency sample. So I have great confidence that it's limited to the proficiency sample.
Listen, I'm impressed by what you did. What I'm concerned about, and I'll tell you why, if you follow the controversies that are going on with respect to the Organization of Scientific Area Committees serving on the Legal Resource Committee, the first standard that they adopted was what's known as ASTM 2329. They adopted wholesale, that had to do with seized drugs and the analysis of drugs, and which was some kind of international standard. And it was plainly scientifically flawed. It had statements in there about getting 0 error rates, and it had a whole menu of tests, A test, B test, C test. I'm sure you're familiar with the
If we could just pause for 1 second, I think it froze.
What?
Mike, can you hear us now, or?
Yes, I can now. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, I'm sorry,
And-
thing froze. Sorry about that.
There's a tremendous amount of controversy about this because this was something that I personally never understood. That I always assumed that people were doing drug quantitations and these analyses in a way that after how many years have we on this commission, Peter?
22.
22 years, I basically sat here saying, oh, this must all be right. And now I'm realizing, looking at that standard, that it is very complicated, especially when you're getting all these different drugs and you're trying to identify certain analytes. And this really has to be reinvestigated, and other standards have to be put forward. And so the struggle is going on at a national level as to how these should be, because when you look at these combinations of tests, some of them are just not, they're not independent of each other. And this sort of Chinese menu of, you can use 2 Bs and that's as good as an A, or et cetera, are just crazy. And now, it seems clear to me you've demonstrated that there are serious problems with how these proficiencies are done. So maybe I'm really saying to the lab directors, you may want to rethink some of these, what a better way is to do drug testing. And that's a national discussion, and
Okay.
it sounds to me like you would be a very good person to give that some serious thought. You already are.
So this is just an update at this point. Just a time check. We have about 54 minutes left of the meeting, and we still have some votes to get to. Thank you, Dr. Avila. Next laboratory up is the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. It's a mid-cycle review. No vote is required. Representatives of the lab are here if there's any questions. Okay, next laboratory after that's the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office, Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. They had their annual ABFT inspection. This does require a vote, and again, representatives of the laboratory are here in New York if there's any questions. Hearing no, sorry? Hearing no questions, I'm going to make a motion to renew the New York State accreditation to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office Toxicology Laboratory for the period covering July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2018. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor? All against? Okay, any abstentions? All right. Next laboratory is the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. This is a mid-cycle review. There is no vote required. Representatives of the laboratory are here. If there's any questions, documents are in your binder already. Okay, and lastly, under the accreditation tab is the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Laboratory. They had an annual review from ASCLD Lab, and representatives of the lab are here. There's no vote required. It's for informational purposes only. All right, that concludes the accreditation portion.
All right, I think the next thing, if I'm following correctly, we have old business, and I think the first thing under old business is the hair review that we were doing. I don't know, Scott or somebody else wants to start with an update from our working group.
I'd be glad to. We've had one meeting, and I think Ann raised a really serious concern, and I agree with her. And we were going to bring it to you. I'm not sure the commission has the authority to do what we're doing. I understand what Peter's getting at, and I agree 100%. But I think it's, and you're a former elected DA, I think this is a DA issue. It's not the commission's issue. I mean, this is something that prosecutors should work with the lab, but I don't see where the commission has it. I don't see it as the commission's mission. Would you agree with that, Ann?
Yeah, this has to do with the testimony in court given by granted analysts of labs. There are two questions about jurisdiction of the commission. The commission only existed in 1994, so anything prior to that, I would argue we have no jurisdiction. Several of the entities that may have performed such analysis were not defined as laboratories, have never been subject to the authority of the commission, or were not at the time that they did the analysis. So there's an issue of, do we have any authority to go ask for old stuff? And two, as the testimony was given in court, and we've asked labs, we've told labs, the labs have been told by the FBI that if their staff were trained by the FBI, that they need to go back and look at this. We've asked them to go back and look at this and tell us whether there are any such cases on a modest sampling. We've shown them the way. I don't think, I agree, I don't think it's our authority to require them to submit to us. Should they inform the DA when they find a problem? Well, and should the DA be asking if they recall a case? Yeah, but I don't think it's a quality assurance performance issue of the laboratory. I've never understood whether our technical accreditation extends to the point of testimony of the analysts. Doing the lab work right is our responsibility.
So let me explain the history of this too, because actually Scott is saying something a little bit different than I thought you said at the meeting we had on February 9th.
No, my position always was that we had Ann's concern, which I totally understood, but then we said, well, having that in mind, that we would go back to Mike Green, then let's talk about the other things. I've always felt this is a DA responsibility. Ethically, DAs, and as an elected DA, if I'm aware that there is prior testimony that is inappropriate, I think it's my ethical responsibility to notify whoever the defense attorney was.
I appreciate that. What happened at the meeting we had on February 9th, which you signed off on at that time, was there was a consensus of our working group, which included Marvin, yourself, Ann, Willie, and myself, to move forward.
Assuming we had jurisdiction.
No, I'm gonna get to that. Okay, I promise.
Okay.
Okay, that to move forward with the hair review, that we all agreed that there was at that time that we agreed that there was a duty to review certainly the cases that we would have jurisdiction over, and raise the question of whether or not we had jurisdiction for pre-94 cases, and I'll take that up separately in a minute. But we agreed that there should be a review, and we also agreed that we would work with Mike Green to create a reviewing body that was a little bit different than the reviewing bodies in some of the other states that are doing state reviews. It would be a reviewing body exclusively comprised of scientists, that certainly the scientists could look to a prosecutor or defense attorney to consult with to get some understanding of context and how these things occur in the criminal proceeding, but that fundamentally what we're asking is, did the testimony or the content of the report exceed the limits of science? And that's fundamentally, perhaps almost exclusively, a scientific inquiry. And that was also a consensus of the working group. And that was held back in February. And it is my fault that we did not commence to have those meetings with you, Mike. I got sidetracked on a bunch of other work responsibilities the last several months, and so I didn't do that. But since that time, a number of things have happened. One is the number of states, I'm not talking about district attorneys, the number of states either through commissions or some type of external review unit, external to DAs, has doubled in the last several months since we met. There are now 7 states that have commenced hair reviews. Most recently, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation wrote a letter to our governor, Governor Cuomo, in the last week, recommending that the state do a review, along with all the other states, who had sent state and local criminalists to attend the FBI hair training over the last few decades. This letter also referenced the fact that the laboratories in New York and other places were notified of the names of personnel who actually attended the training programs. And the concern at the FBI was that just as we were training our own people at the FBI laboratory to testify in a manner that was inconsistent with prevailing science and exceeded the limits of science, there was a concern at the FBI that that was part of the training program also for the state and local criminalists who attended. A list was attached, I believe, in the letter to Governor Cuomo, but it was also, I think, attached to the laboratories. You should know that New York State actually sent more laboratories to the training program at the FBI than any state in the Union except one. That in fact there were 10 laboratories that participated in that training at the FBI, and the people who participated and the dates they attended have all now been documented and given to the state of New York. And it was because of that that the director of the FBI sent out the letter this week expressing his concern that, you know, we at the FBI may have been responsible for injecting error into state criminal justice proceedings. And he goes on to say that the FBI has notified the labs which sent employees to the training, and I encourage you, the governor, to ask your state and local labs to ensure their examiners were staying within the bounds of science, and if they weren't, to take appropriate corrective action, which would include not only a duty to correct, but a duty to notify the appropriate stakeholders who may have been affected by testimony or report writing that exceeded the limits of science. So if anything, as a result of that, more states now have been getting into this review. And the reviews are not, Scott, being conducted by the district attorney's offices in any of the states that have started this review.
Just so you understand my position, and just so my position is clear, and I was trying to be polite during the meeting, but what my position is, and I have absolutely no problem, and I do believe the governor should put together a committee of what he wants to do, and I think that's what I was trying to say. I don't think it should be defense attorneys. I don't think it should be, it needs to be scientists, and it needs to be something looked at, but I did agree with Ann. I think there's a jurisdictional issue, and to be honest with you, Peter, I think just the fact that we only met once emphasizes the problem. This is something, if the governor wants to put a committee together, and I totally agree with it, I think the state should look at it, but I'm not quite sure this is the proper committee to do it. That's my issue. I totally agree with you, and I think I was totally on board at the meeting, and I think I emphasized, I don't think it should be a political thing. I don't think it should be defense attorneys or prosecutors. I think it should be scientists that are looking at the testimony and saying, okay, that was wrong, or it shouldn't be something at this committee's level. And that I agreed with Ann. I think we all agreed before 94 is totally a problem. And then there was some question, but putting that aside, my position is, and I do believe the letter written to the governor, I think this is a governor's issue. He needs to sit down, and he needs to decide whether he wants to put together a committee in the state, review this issue, because this committee doesn't have jurisdiction over DAs. We've already seen that problem. We've seen that problem when we were asking for the transcripts. We can't get the DAs. The governor can.
Scott, just to be clear on this, okay? And I agree with you that it should be scientists who lead the review. We have the jurisdiction to do that. This commission does. The Texas Commission, not the governor, is conducting the review that's going on in Texas. In Virginia, it's the Forensic Advisory Board to the lab system that's conducting the review of Virginia. And it goes like that in each of the states. I have a memo which I'll now distribute. It's one set is for each of the commissioners, and it was designed to. You get my marked up copies because I don't think I had enough for everybody. If you could give this out to each of the commissioners. And the law firm of Latham and Watkins was kind enough as a pro bono matter to, thank you, to prepare a memo asserting on the question of jurisdiction that was raised by Ann Willey at our last meeting. Unfortunately, the memo wasn't produced finally until yesterday. But in that memo, which I urge you all to look at, Mike, you're going to have one sent to you by Brian. I apologize. They make a very compelling argument as to why we have jurisdiction of old cases as well. There can be no question that the problem with testimony provided by the criminalist who comes from a laboratory is quintessentially within the jurisdiction of this body. The Commission has a broad mandate and statutory corrective action program provides the authority to review pre-1994 forensic practices, including hand microscopy testimony. The Commission's prior review, we already did a review, and we asked the states to give us the first 5 cases from the 80s and 90s. We couldn't have even done that unless that was within our jurisdiction, and we did do that. The review of pre-1994 cases is consistent with the Commission's statutory objective of encouraging cooperation with forensic laboratories and criminal justice agencies, as explicitly articulated in the state statute. And the only reason not to do it, would be if there was some retroactive concerns. And the kinds of retroactive concerns which the New York State courts identify is when you want to go back and do something before the effective date, which would have an impact and impair certain contractual rights or property rights. And this doesn't do that at all. This is clearly within the jurisdiction of the Commission. Every other state that's considered it has found it within the jurisdiction of their commission or analogous body. If we don't do it, there is no one who will. I certainly applaud you, Scott, for mentioning that prosecutors do have that duty to correct if they see it. But as you yourself just said, it shouldn't be a prosecutor or a defense attorney who determines whether or not the testimony of a lab employee exceeded the limits of science. That's fundamentally a scientific question. What you can do as a prosecutor and what a defense attorney can do is, if they're notified that the testimony exceeded the limits of science, a defense attorney talking to his client can say, do you want to go back into court? And a prosecutor can decide what, if any, action to take in response. I mean, that's how we do things. Lawyers sort of work in that forum. Scientists work in a different forum.
But
we have the responsibility.
Peter, not to interrupt you, but the problem that we had when we tried to do this as this body, and that's where I think that if the governor was to decide that he wanted to create some subcommittee, even underneath Mike Green and DCJS, or however he wanted to do it, we ran into a major problem here in that we don't have jurisdiction over the DAs to get these transcripts. So I guess my question keeps coming back, because Fitzy and I both went to the DA's Association and all but begged the DAs to get the transcript. But from this commission, we have no power to make them comply. And I guess that's where my concern becomes. We have no jurisdictional power to mandate the people that we need to do this. So it seems to me that the right avenue would be that the governor needs to sit down with the legislative body and determine how can you create something, and ask you and ask Marvin and Barry and whomever he wants to ask. But I just don't see this body. We don't have the power to make the people respond. So we're spinning our wheels.
We're not necessarily spinning our wheels, Scott, and I appreciate the question you're raising. But in each of these other states, they too don't have the power to mandate that prosecutors supply transcripts. In fact, the FBI didn't have the power. What they did is they had persuasion. And I would think Okay, and by the way, I think that that you and District Attorney Fitzpatrick did an incredible job. I know that he was more active in this, in enlisting the help of different prosecutors in the state to actually get transcripts that we needed, and did a great job at that. In these other states, they also don't have that power, but the prosecutors have been cooperative. And I think they've been cooperative for the same reason that you articulated, that if in fact there's been a testimony that was improper, that exceeded the limits of science, then you too have an ethical sort of duty to find out about it and look into it and see whether it affected the underlying conviction. And I think because of that overarching understanding by prosecutors who are fair-minded, there has been this kind of cooperation. And we expect there to be cooperation. If there isn't cooperation, then that's a problem that we haven't faced yet. But don't expect there'll be a lack of cooperation. On the contrary, I expect there will be cooperation. And we will also get the help, and we've been offered the help, of the New York State Attorney General's office, Eric Schneiderman's office, that they were willing to dedicate at least one or two people who would also go around the state using their different offices to help secure transcripts of the cases that are identified by the different laboratories. But what I will say at this point in time, that we should not kick the bucket down the road, kick the can down the road, to leave it to the governor to do or somebody else. We are the commission responsible for regulating forensic service providers in this state. It's forensic service providers in this state which may have had employees provide testimony in excess of the science, and they have a duty and we have a duty to move on corrective action when we identify those situations. The memo that I've given you, I think, lays out quite clearly why our jurisdiction extends, just as it did when we did the initial review of 5 cases in the 80s and 90s to the pre-1994 cases. That can be taken up separately, whether it does, because even if it didn't, we could still look at post-94 cases. So what I would like to do is have this body vote on a motion that we will go forward, that the working group will continue to meet with Mike to try and come up with a group of scientists who can do the review, that this body will also answer another question that Ann Willey noted, namely, we didn't come up with any content yet for what a notification should say. I do think that that's something that the members of this working group can come up with, because that raises in some ways fundamentally legal questions as opposed to scientific questions. So neither of those things are that difficult that way. And then we can work out later on, perhaps at the next meeting, if other people wish to weigh in, on whether or not the jurisdiction extends to cases beyond 1994. The memo says it does. People may provide authority to the contrary, and then we can take it from there. But at least I'd like to move forward right now.
I got your motion, but I would just say this. I just think, Scott, on the other end of it, I just think that we would, as the commission, I would prefer that we go to the governor, we go to the attorney general, and we sit down and we say, this is an issue that we feel needs to be addressed. And maybe I wasn't clear on the phone. I always envisioned in my head that this committee would be a committee that worked under the auspice of Mike Green as the commissioner of the Criminal Justice Services, not as a subcommittee of us. I thought that it would be something that he would oversee. It would be a special committee that was put together to review this. It would be an ad hoc committee that would do what it had to do and then disappear. That's what I always envisioned. I would much rather have us, whoever we choose, as the head of whoever. I'm sure the governor doesn't want to see every single one of us, but somebody from our commission to sit down with the governor, sit down with the attorney general, and say, this is an issue that needs to be addressed by the state of New York, and we're asking you to put together a committee. That is what I would like to see done. I don't think we have the time, to be honest with you. I think you're a busy man. I'm very busy. Everybody here is busy. But this is something that the state needs to address, but it's not. I don't see it as being under us. I see it being underneath the governor and unfortunately underneath Mike, but the Department of Criminal Justice Services.
Now wait a minute. I'm going to weigh in, Peter. Hang on. I've listened long enough. couple of things I think we got to get straight here. You referenced a letter from the FBI director to the governor, and I thought you said in the last couple of weeks. The only letter I'm aware of is one dated February 26th of 2016 from the FBI director to the governor. And basically the conclusion of the letter, in the ask that he makes of the governor, is he says, I encourage you to ask your state and local labs to ensure their examiners were staying within the bounds of science, and if they weren't, to take appropriate corrective action. Now, I've listened to everybody. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think at some level, we as a commission had and have the ability to look at cases, but I think you need to think about what our role is as a commission, and we can only do it in the context of that role. And simplifying greatly, our role is to exercise oversight and regulation over labs and make sure the labs are working properly. And we did the review we did, at least as I understood it, in that context. We wanted to take a sampling of cases, and we wanted to understand what was happening so that we could get a handle on what, if anything, we should do in our role as regulating and overseeing labs. When that bleeds over into a body that's going to start working on the adjudication of individual cases, then I think that takes it outside the purview of the commission, because we have, there's a process set up by law. If anyone believes there's an injustice done in an individual case, prosecutors have obligations and responsibilities, judges have obligations and responsibilities, labs, but I just don't see, if we're going to do a case-by-case review, going through transcripts, everything in a case to decide whether or not we think there was an impropriety in that case or in that trial or in that testimony, to me, that's not the commission's role, and we should not go down that path. So, I hear what everyone... No, Peter, let me finish first, and then you can say whatever you want.
Sure.
I hear what everyone is saying. I hear Peter's motion, but for the reasons that I just articulated, I intend to vote against Peter's motion. I think Peter's right. We should stop kicking the can down the road. I think it's time to put this to bed once and for all right now. Peter's made a motion. If someone there is going to second it, then second it and put it to a vote.
Let me respond, Mike. First of all, no one's asking this review group, which frankly already exists in these other states, and they don't find it as burdensome as you are suggesting, to review not entire transcripts, but simply to review the testimony, which is often not more than a few pages, of the hair microscopist who testified at the trial. In fact, because of some of the concerns that Scott mentioned, that District Attorney Fitzpatrick had mentioned beforehand, this group would not get into the weeds of the case. This group would not consider whether or not something was material or non-material. All this group of scientists would do would make an assessment of whether or not the testimony exceeded the limits of science, and then defense attorneys and prosecutors would be notified. If the defendant and defense attorney don't act on that and don't do anything in court, there will be no adjudication. So this review group is not doing any kind of legal adjudication. They're doing the same kind of review which the FBI did, which is going on in Texas, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Iowa, the District of Columbia, and Virginia. And I think more states are now going to be joining this review process as a result of the additional letter that went out on June 10th and can be found at the Department of Justice website, FBI website. It went up yesterday. It was posted. And it's the website location of it is actually referenced in the memo that I just handed out here in New York. Mike, the reason that the director's letter says that the FBI has notified the labs and encourages you to ask the state and local labs, you, the governor, to do an evaluation of the testimony is because very few states have commissions like we have. In fact, the only state that has something quite like this is Texas. And so there are other bodies that somehow get involved in this undertaking. But we are the body. We are exclusively the body that has responsibility for regulating forensic science laboratories in this state. And if by this vote we decide that we're not going to take on that responsibility within our jurisdiction, then so be it. And that'll be the vote. But let's get one thing very, very clear here. Already there have been more than 80 exonerations of people who were convicted, at least in part, by erroneous testimony involving hair microscopy. I brought to the attention of this New York State Commission at least two instances where individuals who received that FBI training gave inappropriate testimony in New York cases where people were subsequently exonerated through DNA. And so it is a problem here in New York. When we first brought this to your attention and we wanted to have a review in New York like these other states, that was more than 2 years ago. I have no idea how many other wrongfully convicted people there are in New York who were convicted, at least in part, based on erroneous hair microscopy testimony or report writing, but there's obviously some. Some have already been identified. Some have already been exonerated. And if we vote against having a review, even a review of scientists, then I want that vote very, very clear on the record. I want it to be very transparent. Who voted against a review, any kind of review conducted by this commission, and who voted for it. And that'll be the record. And I agree, we can't kick this can down the road any longer. We just have to go on the record with it. So the motion is, quite simply, so there's no misunderstanding, that we move to allow the work group to work with Mike Green at coming up with a group of scientists who can do the review, that the work group with Mike Green come up with a protocol for implementation for working with the laboratories, and that the work group with Mike Green come up with an implementation plan for notification of prosecutors, defense attorneys, or institutional defenders when appropriate.
Peter, just so that, again, we're totally transparent, we all understand exactly what we're voting on. Yeah, I hear you say notification, but with this work group, as part of your motion, that this work group go through individual cases and review transcripts or other information from individual cases and make determinations on whether or not it believes there are issues with individual past cases involving hair comparison.
Sure, clarify that. No, the working group, which right now is comprised of Scott, Ann, Marvin, and myself, will not be conducting any case reviews at all. That the people who actually would review the microscopist's testimony or the content of a 1 or 2 page report would be a committee of scientists exclusively. It could be a committee of 3 scientists who have the appropriate subject matter expertise to undergo that kind of evaluation, but it certainly would not be the 4 members of the Commission's work group.
All right, so you're asking, let me just clarify. So in your motion, you're asking that the Commission create another group of scientists that will review individual hair cases, including a review of transcripts, files, in the details of individual cases. Is that accurate?
No, that's not accurate. Not transcripts and files. They will review the limited testimony by a hair microscopist at trial, but not the rest of the transcript, not the prosecutor's closing or the defense attorney's closing, because those are issues which go to whether or not something had an impact on the actual trial. but instead that this group of scientists will simply review the microscopist testimony and the microscopist lab report to see whether or not statements in the report or his or her testimony exceeded the limits of science. Period. Very, very limited.
What time frame and what cases does your motion encompass?
Well, so the only issue really left open is the one that was initially raised by Ann Willey, where Ann suggested that we may not have jurisdiction to look at cases that existed before 1994. I submitted a memo to everybody today making the compelling argument that it does extend beyond 1994. So my motion is simply that we do it, and that at some later meeting, okay, after people have had a chance to digest our memo and provide other authority to the contrary, if such authority exists, that a determination can be made by the commission as to whether or not the cutoff is 1994 or that we go back beyond 1994. So in my motion, I'm not putting a specific date on it. I'm leaving that as a second issue that will be decided at the next meeting.
So your motion is open-ended enough that it could include pre-94 cases?
It could or it may not, depending upon what this commission decides at the next meeting.
All right. Does anyone second Peter's motion?
I'll second it as a friendly amendment if it helps, Mike. I had 2 points. One, in adding to what Peter said, notify courts. I think he left out courts as well as district attorneys and defense lawyers, number one. And then number two, if it would help, we can review, we can take his proposal for everything at 1994 and then separately vote on anything pre-94, because I don't want to have people voting against the proposal just because they have an issue on the jurisdictional point.
And who's preparing the documents for the scientists to review?
I mean, so what we would work out, okay, the working group, first of all, I accept Barry's amendments as friendly. Secondly, with respect to your question, Ann, the working group would work with DCJS. When I say Mike, I don't mean just Mike, I mean Mike and the staff of DCJS, to figure out the most efficient way to communicate directly with the laboratories that we have regulatory authority over, to identify those cases where hand microscopy was used. The way we thought about it in the working group was you want to identify, and I actually wrote an email on it, I'll use the exact wording so there's no misunderstanding, a review which identifies all cases where either laboratory reports or transcripts assert an inculpatory positive hair association and in which the defendant either pleaded guilty or was convicted after trial. So to identify that group of people would take cooperation between DCJS, okay, and the labs, and then after that, it would require cooperation, which hopefully we would get from both New York State District Attorneys and Eric Schneiderman's office that's already offered to provide personnel to help us secure old transcripts. So, there are different players in this who provide different roles. But that's what they're doing already in the 6 or 7 other states. They've brought people together and they're moving forward with it, and they're getting cooperation from district attorneys, they're getting cooperation from the laboratory directors, and they're getting the cases.
All right. Now, I think we have a motion on the table.
Is the motion open for discussion?
Sure.
And Peter knows this. I take exception to the description of the discussions of the working group as having arrived at a consensus. Usually consensus means greater than a majority, and there's usually an opportunity for a dissenting opinion. I take strong exception to the issue of authority for cases prior to the existence of the commission. in the list of entities that sent staff to FBI training, there are entities that did not and do not exist as laboratories under our authority. We haven't discussed whether we have any authority to ask those entities for any of this information. And I object to Peter having received additional information, obviously pertinent to the working group, never presented to the working group, never discussed by the working group.
What information are you referring to, and when you make an allegation like that, what information are you saying?
I object to
In the memo?
Yes.
The memo is something I just received. You see
I
the date of it.
understand that, Peter.
Okay.
Therefore, as chair of the working group, you should call another meeting of the working group rather than bringing it. I mean, it's fine. The commission can have it. I don't care about that. But I want to be on record as having feeling that this working group has not worked as a group, all right? And we can go back to voting on the motion.
Yeah, no, but Ann,
And I
that's
just
why
want to
I'm
make
just-
clear, too, before we vote on this motion, I am opposing the motion. I think that this takes us far afield of our role as a commission. If this motion is defeated, I intend to make another motion that the commission take action in two areas. One, consistent with the request of the FBI director. I think we ought to communicate to labs. I think they've already been communicated with, but I think we ought to communicate the FBI director's request to the laboratories as he asked. And secondly, I think we need to make sure going forward, and our job is regulating laboratories, that review and conclusions and reports and testimony about those review of hair, to the extent it's even being done anymore, does not exceed the bounds of science. But I think the motion as presented takes us into areas that belong to the courts and prosecutors and defense lawyers and not to this commission.
Mike, could I also be heard? I'm going to vote no for this, and I'm going to vote no with the following, though. I believe that, depending on what the vote is, if it's voted down, I think the commission should reach out to the governor and ask the governor to either issue an executive order or whatever power he has to have the attorney general commit a committee to create a committee, which he already has, is my understanding, a conviction integrity unit, that will look at this, will address this, and they clearly would have jurisdiction to force people to respond. So I'm going to vote no with that understanding, that I think we should reach out to the governor. As you do often, Mike, when you write letters that, based upon what we do, we should write a letter to the governor and say, we think that you should consider this. I'm going to vote no with that understanding.
I have a question. I know I'm new to the commission, but it would seem to me that this multi-page document that's been presented to us today would deserve some careful consideration, and maybe what we should do is table this motion at this time, allow the subcommittee to have another meeting to review this document, and maybe then some kind of consensus could be reached, or at least the subcommittee as a group could take a position, or a majority position, a dissenting position as to the contents of this motion. I mean, I certainly haven't had an opportunity to digest this with any, I read the executive summary, but I would like to read the entire thing and be fully informed on it.
Judge, but the memo, I think, goes to the issue of whether or not you're going to consider pre-1994 cases.
I don't know what the memo really goes to, because it's a...
That's what it does.
11-page memo with no
well,
appendices.
that's what you tell me it does, but...
No, because in the first line, it says, we've been asked by Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck to determine whether the Forensic Science Commission has authority to review testimony provided by New York Forensic Laboratory that predate the commission's establishment in 1994.
I read that.
That's the only
yes.
issue.
Well, yes, but implicit in that is an assumption that we have the authority to review post-1994.
Well,
that's implicit in this memorandum.
Well, I think that...
I think,
yeah, and
I haven't read it.
And right, and what I'm saying to you is I don't think there's any question that
There
the
is
commission...
question.
Well,
I've
if
raised
you have
that
that
question.
if you have that question, that this commission doesn't have the authority to look at reports from forensic analysts.
That's not what you've asked to look at.
No,
You've asked to look
no.
at testimony.
Both reports and testimony, all right?
And I object to our having
I
authority
understand.
over
If
the
you're-
testimony.
If you're taking the position that the commission doesn't have the right to review testimony of analysts.
That's
When
what I'm
this is
thinking.
in the ISO guidelines, this is something that the FBI and all laboratories are being asked to do. This is something in the accreditation that laboratories are supposed to conduct review of their analysts to make sure they're not testifying beyond the limits of science. I think
You and I can disagree.
we disagree profoundly, and I don't know where you're coming
We
from
have
on that
many
end.
things,
I
Barry.
know, and we've
Well,
been
not
here
the first time.
we're longest-serving commissioners, and if that's what you think we've been doing for 22 years,
And I'd also,
I don't
I also
understand
urge
why
you to
you
actually
don't.
read the ASCLD accreditation and the ISO rules, which actually mandate, okay, that there be a review of
I didn't
testimony.
say labs don't have to review
Just one
it.
second.
I just said I
Well,
don't think
we
should
have
look at
respons-
individual cases. Period. I've always had that.
One of the things that we do that's actually required in the statute, Ann, is that we regulate corrective actions
That's right.
taken by the laboratory.
By the
And,
laboratory.
but
That's
Ann,
not
Ann,
testimony.
And if the people give inappropriate testimony, okay, and we look at that testimony and we see that they haven't done anything about it, okay, then that's part of our regulatory scheme. That's what I'm talking about. And
All right, now wait a minute, wait. I don't want to get too far afield here. Peter, you've made a motion, Barry has
I have.
seconded it, and the judge has raised the idea of putting this over. I think since it's your motion, I'd like you to respond to whether or not, what's your response to the judge's request?
Well, I just want to be clear that the motion, that the friendly amendment is that first we're going to vote.
I didn't make a friendly amendment.
No, my
Oh,
amendment.
okay.
I just want to make sure that I think it's
I
responsive.
made a motion to table.
I understand.
Okay.
And I'm opposing your motion to table for this reason, right? Because I respect your position on reviewing the document as to whether there's legal authority. My friendly amendment was to take Peter's motion as it is, right, and just do it for cases first, right? From 1994 forward, right? And I would then say that, whether we do it at this meeting or the next meeting, right, you can take a motion to deal with the pre-1994 cases. That's one thing. Ann's objection, as she has made clear now, is more fundamental and profound with respect to the Commission's ability to review the testimony of analysts and have them take corrective action. And I would note that the rules of professional responsibility propounded by the National Commission on Forensic Science say that is an ethical obligation of forensic scientists in the lab. I think that is so clearly within our ambit. I understand, Ann, that you have a different view of that, but I think it's clearly wrong. And I just want to make sure that the vote on the cases from 94 forward, right, is clear on that point, number one. And then number two, I totally appreciate what Scott's saying about being able to have the resources, being able to get the transcripts, but I want to make it clear that Peter's motion, and the one I'm seconding, is talking about, A, having scientists, and if necessary, we can ask the governor to pay for it, right? Or somebody paying for it, maybe even the Attorney General, right? So we can get the transcripts, can look at the transcripts and look at the results, have the scientists make an assessment, which, by the way, is, kind of going on in other jurisdictions. It's not all that complicated because the FBI review is sort of spelled out what the errors are, number one. And then number two, that the report from that group would then be given to district attorneys, courts, and defense lawyers who would then themselves take a look at it and decide whether it was material and whether any further action is taken. Now, I think that motion, right, is plainly within the ambit of what this commission can do, and I would just say that I appreciate Scott's concerns about the resources, and the only difference here is that I think that this commission, just certainly for the 94 forward cases, right, should have some understanding and oversight as to how that goes about. I don't think I think we should at least keep jurisdiction over that. So
let me just,
that's the
I was going to
I just
respond
want-
to your request, if you'd like.
Please.
Okay. So
Because I think once I make a motion at the table under Robert's rules,
Right.
that
Yeah.
takes priority over the vote
I agree.
on your
I agree.
substantive
I
motion.
just wanted to make sure
Yeah, I
you
mean-
understood the difference.
Judge,
I understand the difference.
Judge, so, as you heard before, this may very well be my last meeting, okay, after
would be
22
that
years.
would be a loss to me.
Okay, no. And this issue, remember, it's only after there were dozens of wrongful convictions identified in the United States where erroneous hair microscopy evidence was involved in the original trial that this issue arose. And first you had the FBI looking at it, and then the FBI realized, and by the way, what I'm telling you now are things that we all discussed in this body before you joined the commission.
I've read about it. you know.
Right, but so you have to appreciate that there's at least a background here before you joined us, and we discussed the fact that that the state and local examiners were trained, participated in 2-week training programs, where it appears that during those 2-week training programs, they were taught, in effect, to provide testimony which exceeded the limits of science. And that's why we started to then look at state cases as well as the FBI cases.
And that's all appropriate.
Yeah.
Absolutely
Okay,
appropriate.
and so
And
then
we
a
hear-
number of states began to say, you know what, we will now do state investigations where our state and local microscopists did the testimony, and they've already identified a number of cases in those states where there have been exonerations now.
We hear
and
wrongful
vacatures.
conviction cases too. I mean, I've heard several,
Right.
you know.
I appreciate that. So what happened is beginning 2 years ago, we first came to this commission and recommended that New York do what these other states are doing and what the FBI is doing. And now you have, most recently, a letter from the director of the FBI to the governor, really urging the states to do this kind of review. And since this commission has jurisdiction for regulating the quality of work put out by all the forensic service providers in the state, or the major ones anyway, 22 of them, that we felt it was appropriate that it emanate, if you will, from this commission working with DCGS. So that's the historical background. And because it's been 2 years, and because this could be my last meeting, I'm not going to table this discussion for a time where I can't even participate and vote on the substance of this matter. That's why I'm more than happy to accept Barry's amendment that the first vote be limited to only those cases post-1994, so that the only real issue is whether or not we have a jurisdiction for older cases. With respect to Ann Wiley's other comment about laboratories that may not be within the jurisdiction of this commission, obviously we only have jurisdiction for those laboratories for whom we have jurisdiction. And I'm not asking us to exceed the jurisdiction. So for those reasons, I appreciate from whence your suggestion comes. It makes a lot of sense, but I can't table this for another meeting. I'd like to have a vote on it at this meeting with the friendly amendments that Barry suggested.
I would like to make a quick comment about this, and also I think Judge Mazzarelli's motion is thoughtful, getting an 11-page, very comprehensive document with no attachments. There's no time to digest it. But I'm going to make the part that the memo is essentially moot, and the reason the memo is moot is because the people that really have the obligation, have always had the obligation to do this, are the laboratories. The people the FBI noticed are the laboratories. The people the FBI noticed are the DA's offices. In this particular case, I believe the commission has actually gotten in the way of this happening because the commission jumped in right from the beginning and has been going through and deciding what to do, and we've prevented the labs from actually identifying these cases and doing anything with them. So I think the motion that Peter has on the floor is way too broad. It doesn't narrow down the types of cases, either rapes or homicides or any case at all. It doesn't talk about positive inculpatory like we talked about before. I think what it does is it sets up another level of bureaucracy that prevents this from actually getting done. So I would not support Judge Mazzarelli's motion to table it because I think we're at a point where we need to do something. I would not support Peter's motion to go through because I feel it's too overtly broad. I would make a motion when we're done to actually have the laboratories identify these cases, notify the DA's office, and start taking action instead of us getting in the way of that.
So just to be clear on that, Brian, in terms of the laboratories voluntarily doing what they are required to do ethically and what we want to mandate them to do through this undertaking. It has been clear since 2012 that this problem exists across the country in state and local laboratories as well as the FBI. Askeladd Lab actually notified all the laboratories that it accredits that it should do this kind of evaluation on its own, even without the state getting involved, back in 2013. That's 3 years ago. To my knowledge, not a single laboratory in New York State, indeed, to my knowledge, not a single laboratory in the United States has voluntarily sua sponte gone about finding its own cases and then notifying the appropriate authorities with their duty to correct and notify. Not one. So it can happen just voluntarily. It has never happened voluntarily, and there's no support for it happening voluntarily. That's why we have a regulatory body, because it's the responsibility of this group to make sure that the highest quality is utilized in laboratories throughout the state that we regulate. That's our job. And if we want to shirk that responsibility, then we do it with our eyes wide open, and that's why I want this vote.
All right, I think we need to wrap this up if we're going to get a vote in before Peter's time is over. So we do have a motion from the judge at one point to table. Judge, in light of what Peter has said, would you withdraw that motion, or do you want us to vote on it?
I'll withdraw it.
All right, thank you. So we have Peter's motion with Barry's amendment that this group that would be created to review transcripts and other information in individual cases would apply to all post-94 cases. I just want to be clear, this is not a vote on Ann's interpretation versus Peter's. I've expressed reasons why I oppose it. I think Scott's expressed different reasons why he's opposed it. Ann has expressed different reasons why she does. But we've got a motion, we've got a second. Unless there's any other comment that needs to be made, I think that we ought to vote on it. So all those in favor of the motion? Whose hands are up?
Marvin, Barry, Peter.
All right. All those opposed to the motion? Again, whose hands are up? Mine?
Joe D'Amico, Pat Buffalino, myself, Scott O'Neill, Ann Willie, and Scott McNamara.
All right, and is there anyone who abstains?
Judge Mazzarelli and Ann Walsh.
All right. So that motion does not pass. I would
Michael, before you make a motion, I would just ask that the memo that I circulated to commissioners at this meeting be made part of the public record.
It will, with the notation and the understanding that you had it yesterday and it didn't get circulated to anyone at DCJS or commission members in time that people could get it yesterday and read it, that we received it during the meeting today, that Judge Mazzarelli made a motion to table this so that we could read and thoughtfully consider that memo, and that you and Barry requested the judge withdraw that motion because you wanted it voted on now and you did not want to give the commission members time to read or consider the memo. So with that understanding,
if you're gonna put all
the
of that
memo
in, Michael,
can be made a part of the minutes.
Michael, fine. If you're going to put all that in, then you should also put in the fact that what the memo deals with is whether we have jurisdiction on pre-1994 cases, and that was not the subject of the motion that was voted on. I just want the memo to be part of the record.
The memo's going to speak for itself, Peter. It's part of the record now.
Mike, just let me finish. Okay? I just want the memo to be part of the record so that when other people look at all the materials, they can see this memo and they can use it to help formulate their own thinking on the subject. That's all.
Mike,
yeah, and I just want to make sure that people are clear that the commission members didn't have time to review this memo before they made any decision.
And it should also be made clear that actually the decision they were asked to make did not deal with the substance of this memo. The substance of this memo deals with pre-94 cases, and the vote was limited to post-94 cases. You can put both things in.
That's your opinion, Peter. The memo will speak for itself, and everyone can draw their own opinion on that.
Fine.
I haven't had enough time to digest the memo to know if that's true or not.
Mike, this is Scott. I would like to make a motion that you write a letter to the governor and ask him to utilize his power, be it an executive order or otherwise, to direct the Attorney General of the State of New York to create a committee within his jurisdiction to review the issue that Peter is talking about.
I appreciate that, but before Peter jumped in, I was in the process of making a motion.
I'm sorry.
Peter interrupted.
I withdraw
because
my
he
motion
wanted
for now.
to. All right. I've got a different take on this. I'm looking at a letter from the director of the FBI to the governor asking that, and let me just find the language here. Asking that, it says, I encourage you to ask your state and local labs to ensure their examiners were staying within the bounds of science, and if they weren't, to take appropriate corrective action. So what I would suggest and what I would move is that as a commission, we communicate with every state and local lab that we have jurisdiction over, and that we ask them to do exactly what the FBI director has asked the governor to have them do, that we take the language directly out of the letter, that we include a copy of the letter, and that we ask them to look at this issue for cases where they did hair comparisons, and if appropriate, take corrective action, and that we ask the labs that we have jurisdiction over to report back to us as to what, if anything, they did in response to our request.
Well, Mike, with great respect, I think that obviously I supported Peter's motion as the way to go on this for the commission, but I think the points that he made, that Askeladd Lab had already sent notices out to the labs on this before, and that there's been great difficulty, and I understand, why, in getting transcripts and looking at the reports and conducting this review, and that implicit in this, or it should be explicit, it would be extremely helpful to have an independent group of scientists review this. So I think that Scott's motion would be a superior way to go, frankly, if we're expecting to get anything done. And I do think that people are well-meaning. I'm sure that Fitzy and Scott certainly are our colleagues, district attorney colleagues here, in that they want to get to the heart of it. They want to get the transcripts. They want scientists to review them, see if we went beyond the limits of science. So in the alternative, I certainly would support, if this makes any difference to you, Mike, Scott's suggestion as to what you should do.
I've made the motion, and once my motion is decided on one way or another, then you or Scott or anyone else can make a motion you want. But I've made the motion.
Right, no, I understand.
Is there a second?
Won't you amend it to have them do both? Amend it to do both.
Yeah.
Then we do what Mike do and mine. Put them to both.
Well, if you'll accept an amendment from Scott that
I want them handled separately. I want this one handled without an amendment, and then Scott can make his motion. We can decide that.
Does Mike have a second?
I second that motion.
All right. Mike, one of the fundamental problems with your motion, and why I would strongly oppose it, is that it frankly is a complete abdication of government and an abdication of our regulatory responsibilities. What you want to do is simply ask laboratories to do what they should have done beginning in 2013 when they received the Askeladd Lab letter suggesting that they do this, and none of them have done it. The reason that New York State in 1994 created this commission is it believed that we needed a regulatory body that would have oversight over the forensic laboratories in the state of New York to ensure the highest quality of criminal justice in the state. And that's our job. And by simply writing a letter to these laboratories saying, we think you should do this, okay, which basically is saying we hope that you will voluntarily do it, is that abdication of our regulatory authority. In other matters, we compel the laboratories to do things. In this matter, where so many people have been wrongly convicted as a result of microscopy testimony which exceeded the limits of science, for us to do anything less than mandate the kind of compliance that our motion sought is an abdication of our authority, of our responsibility, and frankly, it's a rejection of the role of government. So I'm strongly opposed to it.
Peter, thank you for your opinion, but I just want to make clear what I'm asking. I've taken the language word for word out of the letter that the FBI director wrote to the governor. I am asking the commission to, in effect, take exactly what the FBI director asked the governor to do and use the commission as a vehicle to do it. If you view what the FBI director asked is an abdication of government responsibility, fine, that's your opinion. But what I'm doing is taking the language directly from that letter and asking this commission to, in effect, do what the FBI director asked be done.
Michael, as you must know, having been a district attorney, under the 11th Amendment, there's only so much that a federal official can ask of state officials. Okay? All he can ask is for and encourage and urge their voluntary cooperation. He, as the federal official, cannot mandate it of the states. But he did mandate it for the federal cases, for the ones that the FBI was involved in. It was mandated. It wasn't voluntary. It wasn't discretionary. And those other states that got the earlier letter from the governor are mandating it in those states. So please don't try and twist and distort, the real meaning of what the director is saying at this point, because what he's saying is something that can be utilized, whether it's by a governor, whether it's by some other state entity. But fortunately, unlike those other states, we actually have an entity that has the power to regulate and mandate certain compliance and corrective actions of the laboratories that we oversee. And for us not to do that when we have that special statutory authority is an abdication. And you call it what you will.
Peter, I think that your diatribe sounds great, but I think it ignores the plain language of the FBI director's letter. He says to the governor, I encourage you to ask. And there's where you're right about the Constitution. He can't say, I order you to ask. He says, I encourage you to ask. And what I'm saying is we should take that encouragement and actually do it. But then he says to ask your state and local labs to ensure their examiners were staying within the bounds of science. He doesn't say, I would encourage you to set up an independent commission. He doesn't say any of that. He says to ask your state and local labs to ensure their examiners were staying within the bounds of science, and if they weren't, to take appropriate corrective action. What I'm suggesting and the motion I've made is to take his encouragement and actually turn it into a directive, that we send the communication to the labs, tell them they need to do it, and ask them to report back to us on what they've done. And we've got a motion, we've got a second. I think both of our opinions are fairly clear at this point. Is there any other discussion before we vote on it? All right, all those in favor? I can't see whose hands are up, so maybe if someone could help me.
Pat Buffalino, Joe D'Amico, myself, Scott O'Neill, Ann Willie, Scott McNamara, Ann Walsh, and Judge Mazzarelli.
All right, anyone opposed?
Marvin, Barry, Peter.
All right, any abstentions?
No abstentions.
All right. On this issue, are there any other motions, discussion?
Yes, I would like to make a motion that you write a letter to the governor asking him to utilize his power, including, if it's appropriate, executive order, direct the Attorney General of the state of New York to create a committee to review this issue and use their powers to compel people to produce the documents that are needed.
I second that.
Any discussion on that?
Scott, could you just flesh it out a little bit more? I mean,
what
would the can you
I
say
would
what
want
the
the
content of
committee
the letter
to do
should be?
just what you wanted us to do. I would want the committee to utilize the Attorney General's powers to make and also to be able to get the transcripts, which we don't have the power to do, to get the transcripts then to put together a committee of scientists in place to review those transcripts to determine whether or not the scientists testified beyond the sciences. And also the Attorney General would have the power to make motions to have these convictions vacated if, in fact, the prosecutor utilized that in their closing arguments. There's so much more power in the Attorney General's office. So I would want the Attorney General to create a committee that would look at these things and address this issue for the state of New York.
So just to ask you, I'm not weighing in yet. So Scott, so there'll be a letter that goes out both from the commission to both the governor and to the Attorney General?
Well,
because they each have a different role, don't they?
No, my motion would be to the governor to utilize his power to direct the Attorney General to do this. I know the governor, from another issue, has the power to give jurisdiction to the Attorney General over certain issues, and I would ask.
Done that recently.
Yes, he did that recently. So I think he does have the power to give the Attorney General the power to look into this.
And that the letter should also enumerate the different substantive things that you just said as well.
Yeah, the things that you were concerned about, yes. To review the transcripts and to make sure the scientists didn't testify in excess of what was appropriate.
Okay.
So I second that.
I guess my concern is that we've asked the labs to take certain motion on their own, so at this point, my position is I will vote against it, because I think we ought to see what response we get from the labs. We're directing their report back to us. If we're satisfied by the review they do, I don't see the need for this. If we're not satisfied by the review they do, then my position might change.
Even though this has been going on for 2 years, and even though Askeladd Lab asked them to do it voluntarily 3 years ago and they didn't do anything, do you still want to kick that can down the road for them, Mike, and just see what happens?
Peter, can I just
I don't view it as kicking the can down the road, Peter, but I certainly respect your right to look at it that way.
Peter, can I just ask you, no offence, but you keep disrespecting the lab directors in regards to, like, we've not done anything. We've tried to follow the guidance of the Commission by looking at cases in the 80s and 90s, I know we're still arguing a different point, but I just feel you keep making the comment that the New York State lab directors have not been doing their duty and obligation. We use the Commission as an oversight, and we use them as a guidance. So I just feel you've said it 3 times now, and I just want to say I find that sometimes it can be insulting. So
Scott, there's 2 ways that things can happen. Okay, the laboratories have a responsibility directly to Askeladd, and they also have ethical responsibilities, hopefully in compliance with the Code of Professional Responsibility that was just endorsed by the National Commission on Forensic Science. Separate and apart from that, this entity has a regulatory responsibility of oversight over your laboratory and other laboratories. So there are 2 different streams by which corrective action can occur. One is corrective action can occur voluntarily within your Askeladd framework, and another way that corrective action can occur is if it's mandated or something happens through this commission. I'm not suggesting anyway that lab directors have been recalcitrant. All I'm simply pointing out, and it's not just lab directors here, is that laboratories on their own across the United States have not rolled up their sleeves and sort of dug into all their old cases to find these cases. And to the extent that you say you look to this commission to provide direction on that, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why it's just so upsetting and distressing to see the vote that we first proposed, the motion we proposed, go down 8-3. I think it's a very, very sad comment. So hopefully, Scott's recommendation to have the governor take on the task that this commission has decided not to take on can be passed.
In fairness, Scott, I mean, I didn't want to take up any time, but when our colleague, toxicologist, which laboratory was it? The last guy that was.
Erie County?
Yeah, the one that wanted the lab director to come in.
Bill.
I don't. He was taking it as a personal insult that we were asking for the lab director to come in, and it wasn't intended.
No, it wasn't.
Intended.
That was not my intent.
And I know that you're not. And I realize that sometimes when these discussions are had about producing things, that it's not it's not personal in any way, and nobody's implying that the labs. I share Scott's view that I just looking at these reviews and implementing the duty to correct, it's a hard thing because you have to go back and get the transcripts. And the transcripts, it may well be that the governor ordering the attorney general to assist here is going to expedite this. And now that Jim Comey has identified everybody that went through the Quantico trainings, we may have a better way of doing this. And one of the problems, I think there are a lot of structural problems with the way this commission, right now is set up. That is to say, I'm not sure it's resourced properly in a lot of different areas. We're going to get to the next one, which I'll be brief about, Mike, the DNA subcommittee. But I think there are things that could be improved even legislatively to make this, and I think Scott put his finger on one of them, perhaps. So we have to think about it. But I think his proposal is a sound one, and because it helps get the transcripts, and that's been, I think, the primary problem in trying to get this review done.
All right, so we have a motion by Scott. Do we have a second?
Yeah, I seconded it.
All right, we have a second. All those in favor? Again, if you can just help me and tell me whose hands are up.
Pat Buffalino, Scott O'Neill, Ann Willie, Scott McNamara, Ann Walsh, Marvin, Barry, Peter, and Judge Mazzarelli.
All right, and anyone opposed?
Myself and Joe D'Amico, Mike Green.
All right. All right, anything else on this issue? We're about 25 minutes over our time right now. So what I would suggest is that we table anything else under old business till our next meeting. We have a bunch of lab disclosures. If there's anything that someone needs to raise that can't wait till the next meeting, go ahead and do it. Otherwise, I'd suggest that we have those wait till the next meeting. And I don't believe there was anything in the materials that would require us to go into executive session to discuss. But again, if someone feels otherwise, I'd be happy to hear that.
Mike, I just ask your indulgence for maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 4 minutes to just discuss the DNA subcommittee letter to us about probabilistic genotyping.
If you don't go more than 4 minutes, I will give you that.
I'll try not to go more than 4 minutes, and I've already expressed these concerns to you privately just the other day. And that is, as some of you may recall, was my motion to ask the DNA subcommittee to hear the presentation from John Butler and Mike Coble. I then went and attended. I think there's some serious structural problems with respect to the DNA subcommittee in this commission. As you know, its findings are binding on this commission. I think right now we have a real problem because they just, number one, I think that they did not do a good enough job in dealing with low-copy DNA and the whole problem there, and that is going to be a big issue for this commission because I simply do not, I am not satisfied that the OCME did internal validation on samples for low-copy DNA on samples of 25 picograms or less with 2 or more contributors. I don't think that we got an accurate representation, and that issue is still out there. And we have an opinion from Judge Dwyer that's never been appealed, saying that low-copy DNA does not pass Fry. I think the DNA subcommittee, unfortunately, let us down in its review of OCME, and even we sent it back 2 or 3 times. On this issue of probabilistic genotyping, it was a concern that I expressed many times with respect to true allele, because it is not the disclosures of the source code and other materials for true allele is kind of a black box. We now have a case in upstate New York dealing with, on the one hand, STR mix got one result that was an inclusion, and true allele got a result that appears not to be an inclusion, and it's a very, very notorious case up there that I actually think Mike actually told me that Bill Fitzpatrick, I didn't even realize that, has some involvement in it. So I'm troubled by that.
St. Lawrence County?
Yeah, St. Lawrence County. And this issue of probabilistic genotyping, in terms of this discussion, it was clear to me, and I'm just saying this for the record, that the problem here is that we're now first getting, by NIST and others, some kind of intra-laboratory comparison of the probabilistic genotyping. There are two primarily that are out there. One is true allele, the other one is STR mix. But there are others, and I'm looking at Ray right now, in Europe that are open source, crowdsourced samples that people might consider that I raised in the meeting. I'm only looking at you with respect to, you're the one that dealt with true allele, that's all.
Well, I mean, that's not a correct characterization of that NIST study. They weren't looking at probabilistic genotyping. I have so much this way as
I mean, I'm sorry, that who?
NIST study was not looking at probabilistic genotyping.
But no, they did comparisons. Tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. Mix 5 and Mix 13, where they sent out samples to.
I'm saying they did not use probabilistic genotyping, so you're incorrect in that particular. You're incorrect.
They sent it to the different vendors of probabilistic.
Did not use probabilistic genotyping.
Right. Well, it just shows if you and I are in.
No, I'm correct.
Well, you're correct.
They were very clear at the subcommittee of the same thing.
If you can give me a better way of phrasing this, my understanding is that they sent out samples to different people to run these programs on them and see what the results were.
Mixture interpretation, not probabilistic.
Oh, mixture interpretation. Thank you. I take your difference. Interpretation of mixtures with probabilistic genotyping programs.
No.
Not even that. Not even that.
He's making it pretty specific.
Okay.
Not use probabilistic.
Whatever. However you want to phrase it, it was clear to me that I think the DNA subcommittee should have done some kind of deeper dive before we just began approving the use of these programs and the internal validation of these programs by the various different laboratories, because they are giving different results. And I'm not here even talking about, if you understand these programs, it's pretty clear that with the Monte Carlo Markov chain, Markov chain Monte Carlo, that even if you run the same program twice, you're going to get different results. And there's scientifically, there are reasons for that.
Right, it's supposed to be.
Right, but I'm talking about comparing, let's say, true allele with star mix, or even looking at open source programs in Europe like LR Mix and others that Peter Gill and David Balding have put forward. I just don't think we've done a good enough job with any of that. And so I just think there's a structural problem here. I was really, the DNA subcommittee didn't even know why the Butler and Coble had come to make a presentation for them. They didn't even know that it was a motion that was passed by the commission that they hear that. And they're all very nice people, but there have been criticisms by people who have left. Ann knows this better than I do because she was present then. Ranjit Chakrabarty, who had been on the DNA subcommittee, felt that there weren't enough resources, not enough time to do a deep dive and discuss these issues. I think that is a problem. Maybe, Scott, same kind of problem we have here in being able to conduct these reviews. But I just don't think that whatever the reason, somebody should look at it. I don't want to cast personal aspersions, but I don't think they've done a good enough job, and it is a structural problem we have here in the commission. And I'm just concerned about it, and I honestly just can't give you an off-the-top my head suggestion about how to do it better or how we should restructure it, but I think it's a matter that deserves attention. And that's all I really want. I just wanted to be on the record about that, Mike, if it's okay with you.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. At this point, we've got to adjourn because we've got to do our ethics training, and we're a half hour past where we're supposed to be. So our next meeting is September 14th in Albany. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I move it.
All right. Do we have a second? Scott? All in favor?
Yep.
All right. Our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. And we will do our ethics training now.
Now you stay in